Hello and welcome to The Stack. For this week's show, we speak with the executive editor of one of the most respected publications on foreign policy. It is Foreign Affairs magazine, plus a new title that investigates the political layers of our entertainment culture. Enjoy the show. From Midori House in London, this is The Stack, 30 minutes of print industry analysis, and I am Fernando Augusto Pacheco. For a little over a century, Foreign Affairs magazine has been the house journal not only of the Council on Foreign Relations, which publishes it, but of the United States foreign policy establishment as whole. It is not only read by people who shape U.S. foreign policy, but written by them. Since its launch in 1922, Foreign Affairs has published essays and book reviews by presidents, generals, and ambassadors. Foreign Affairs executive editor Justin Vogt spoke to Monocle's Andrew Mueller at the recent GlobeSac Forum in Prague.
The place which it seems that the obvious one to start, I guess, well, I'm assuming / hoping the last 2.5 years have been a bit of a golden era for reader interest in foreign policy. Have you noticed a spike in online or offline readership of foreign affairs?
Absolutely. Since 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and this happens periodically, right? There are crises, and crises sort of drive reader engagement and reader interest. So reader interest did go up at that point. Unlike in past iterations, though, it stayed elevated, and it has kind of continued to stay elevated, which is interesting. Another interesting thing that happened, though, is on the other side of the equation, and had to do with our contributors, right? We don't have staff writers. We draw from a kind of expert community of scholars and practitioners. And one thing that happened in an interesting way then was that people who had long sort of only published in print in foreign affairs, or sort of expected that when they wrote for foreign affairs, it would appear in print, they started to become more enthusiastic about writing for web-only pieces because they realized that at the pace of events, if they wanted to, have an impact or kind of do an intervention in terms of discourse or policy, that's actually where they needed to be. So that was sort of an interesting change for us. We are our legacy media organization that is a very much sort of print-centric for almost a century. We've had, web-only content for many years, but there was a big web audience. But amongst the author group, something needed to shift, and we had this kind of external forcing mechanism that did that for us in a way.
But with the print issue, especially given the lead times you must have, has it become more of a challenge in recent years trying to find those pieces or frame those pieces? Because it's certainly something we run up against at Monocle that are insulated against being overtaken by events.
Well, I think it's always been hard. I would actually say in some ways it's gotten easier in the sense that you can see from all the churn what is actually sustainable and what's really important. It's a little bit less of a guessing game in some ways because you have more kind of data, right? You see what's happening with the daily content, with the online content, and you can kind of glean from that what is going to be, on a day-to-day basis, you sort of see how that changes. And that actually helps you. It informs your decision about what's something that's still going to matter in 2 months. What's harder, and the puzzle is, okay, well, how do you break through that churn? How do you make sure that the print piece that you have put more resources into, that you've given more time to, and that you've signaled to your audience matters in a certain way because you've bothered to put it in this beautiful product. How do you make sure that all of that effort and time and resources isn't wasted because the piece doesn't break through?
Is there possibly be helpful to come up with an example of a piece you've run recently or are about to run in the print issue that works as a representation of that, the thing that managed to sort of rise above that churn to, relate something that was still going to be applicable whenever people got around to reading it?
Yeah, I think the one that jumps to mind is we did a piece by Sam Charap, who is sort of a defense expert and has been a kind of Ukraine watcher for a long time, and he wrote a piece for us sort of gaming out what a negotiation sort of might look like to end the war. And this was a piece that generated a lot of heat because it angered a lot of people, and Sam has written a bunch of things in the past couple of years that have angered people. And that piece, we felt we were sort of ahead of the curve and that we could kind of see look, this is where the policy conversation is headed. There's a lot of people who are a little too enthusiastic about it heading there, and a lot of people who are not being kind of realistic enough about where this is all going to go. And sort of being able to pull back and get someone to make a really good argument about that in a way that was informed by what was happening, but that we knew was going to be relevant no matter what, no matter if it was a counteroffensive, an offensive, of this, all the kind of day-to-day stuff. Okay, what's lurking behind all of that is, tell me how this ends. And that's what we put on the cover for that issue.
So do you think you've succeeded or are succeeding then in creating that kind of hybrid model? You have the website that can react pretty quickly to things, and where it doesn't probably really matter all that much if it gets overhauled by events and seems a bit irrelevant a week from now, plus the magazine which takes the broader view?
I hope so.
But how much discussion goes into deciding, though, which of those two forums a potential piece is going to go into?
Oh, yeah. Well, some things are obviously kind of web-only pieces because they need to get out, right? I mean, if you sit on them, they're going to be OBA, right? So, that's easy. The harder one is when we say, well, this is sort of like maybe print. And the sort of instructions to the author there are really important, and how you frame it to kind of tell them, like, look, there's a chance that we're going to put this through a different process. And it's going to have to be kind of bulletproof against time. So we need you in drafting and in our editing, we need to think about that. What's interesting is that sometimes, in fact, those pieces, for either logistical reasons or because of events, they don't wind up going in the print magazine. And what's been interesting to see is how the readers don't, there's a little bit more agnosticism about whether a reader encounters a piece like that online and just ignores it, or whether they really engage with it. We are amazed by how much readers engage with those longer pieces that were sort of print maybe candidates that then appear only on the site or only digitally, and kind of get the same level of engagement that we'd expect from the print piece. That tells us a lot about the audience and what they want and what distinguishes us, I think.
You mentioned earlier that idea of a piece that makes people angry, and obviously anything you write is going to make some people angry, but is there a kind of ongoing institutional conversation about guarding foreign affairs against turning into one of those places, like turning it, especially with a website, turning it into an outrage factory? Because that's easy. Making people angry and generating attention like that is really easy. I like to think myself there's eventually kind of a cost, because people start to realize that's all you do. But how often do you find yourself thinking, okay, on the one hand, this piece would attract a lot of attention. On the other hand, what kind of attention are we attracting here?
I think not often, just because, look, it's foreign affairs.
Yeah.
It's not, we are not an outrage generation machine. We are very, very far from that. And I don't think we're running a risk of becoming that anytime soon.
Broadening out a bit towards the subject you cover, I mean, it is axiomatic, and I'm sure you've heard it many times, that there are no votes in foreign policy. Do you get the impression that this US presidential election is any exception to that rule?
No, honestly. I mean, I don't. I really don't. I just think this is a perennial problem. Now, what changes that are crises, right? So foreign policy can suddenly sort of become an issue, and you never know what's going to happen. And I will say that one election where I feel people don't realize the extent to which that was true was actually 2016, which people tend to forget. The summer of 2016 and leading into the fall, that campaign became very much about terrorism. The Muslim ban, for example, that was all a response to ISIS. And I mean, it wasn't a coherent response to it, but, Trump really used that. And people kind of tend to have forgotten about that. Now, terrorism, the way it's talked about in American political campaigns, is not exactly foreign policy, but it is national security, and it does have to do with people's fears. And so I don't want to discount the possibility that it could become more of an issue. But right now, I think there are people, maybe amongst a certain set of Americans, a certain subset of Americans, this whole question about the direction of American foreign policy, is it going to be liberal internationalist? Is it going to be realist? Is it going to be isolationist? Is really salient and matters to them. I just don't see much evidence that is really on many voters' minds.
Because there is another conventional wisdom, though, that even that notwithstanding, or that eternal fact of life notwithstanding, Americans, having been bruised by a recent series of foreign misadventures, are retreating in on themselves, are becoming more isolationist. Do you think there's anything to that?
I'm not sure. I don't know how much of that is, how deep-seated it is. I mean, I think that was certainly true. It's certainly been an aspect of the last 2 decades in American politics, going all the way back to Iraq. But I was surprised, for example, at how high support for supporting Ukraine, how much support there was and how durable it was. Now, again, it's different at the level of kind of party elites, right? I mean, especially on the Republican side, there's a kind of consensus that, we're done with that. If Trump wins, that we're going to turn the page on that. And among sort of Democratic party elites, there's a sort of sense, I think, that it's like, we don't really talk that much about that because it's not a winner. But then when you look at polling data, it doesn't really show any kind of like total collapse in support for U.S. policy on Ukraine. And more broadly, about America's role in the world, yes, like when you ask polling questions like, should America be the policeman of the world? Of course, people say no, but it's one of those things where if you frame it differently, you get different answers. So again, I would say more than any kind of like pendular swing away from liberal internationalism, what you're mostly seeing is the fact that like most voters in most democracies, foreign policy tends to be pretty low on the list.
So even if voters themselves aren't all that bothered, does this election strike you as nevertheless a major foreign policy election? There is, some people are of the view that really whoever's in the White House, even if it is a, for want of a more pejorative expression, unusual occupant like Donald Trump, American foreign policy is essentially bipartisan and consensual. And there are those that do believe that certainly a restored Trump might go hurtling off in a completely different direction. Do you think that the choices are actually stark in terms of foreign policy?
I do. Although I don't know exactly what's, behind door number 2. I think I know what's behind door number 1. I think it's probably continuity with what we've seen for the past.
This, to be
years.
clear, is Vice President
Harris. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's not a lot of. I would be skeptical of anyone who told you, oh, well, this is what she'll do here, and this is what she'll do there, and this is her vision, because she's got this very brief campaign, and it hasn't really come up yet. It might, but and it'll be interesting to see when it does. But I think it's safe to assume that it's not going to be a massive departure from what you've seen in the last 4 years. The problem is door number 2, which is, which Trump are we going to get if we get Trump? And I'll say this, that I think I'm hearing at this conference, and I'm sure you heard, a lot of fear and sort of doom and gloom about Russia and Ukraine and transatlantic relationship. And maybe that's all totally justified. Certainly there's plenty of evidence from the last time that, it's not going to be smooth sailing. But I think it tends to discount just how unpredictable Trump is and how sort of impulsive and almost erratic his style of governing is. So I hesitate. I try to remind people that what happened the first time around, there's also this narrative that's developed in the American media that like, oh, it's going to be totally different this time because now they know what they're doing and there aren't going to be these like adults in the room, these establishment figures. I'm just not totally convinced that that's true because I really don't think it matters that much. What matters is what Trump kind of in any given moment decides to do, and it's really hard to predict. So I'm a little. I guess my final point on this is just that I'm a little bit cautious about these like, worst case scenario Trump scenarios that I hear a lot of, especially here in Europe. Again, they might be right, but there is a possibility that what you get the second time around is kind of like what it was the first time around. Not to say that that was great, especially for the Europeans, but it wasn't as catastrophic as, at least for American foreign policy, as I think some people tend to remember it. Domestic policy, different issue.
Just finally then, we are of course always happy to try and tempt readers towards picking up or subscribing to a print publication, even if it isn't Monocle. We just assume, we take that as read. What does Foreign Affairs have coming up that you would be especially keen for people to read in print?
So here's what I'll tell you. It's not a dodge, but they're relating to this conversation. There's actually some stuff in our archive that I think would be really interesting to your readers, particularly now. And here's why. We talked about how Vice President Harris's ideas about foreign policy they haven't been kind of laid out in great detail. However, her 2 top advisors are both people who are contributors to Foreign Affairs, who've written on one case, Phil Gordon, who's her national security advisor, has written many pieces for Foreign Affairs. And his deputy, Rebecca Lissner, is also someone who's written for Foreign Affairs. There are 2 pieces, and I can give you their titles. They're fascinating because I think they do kind of suggest a direction that, a President Harris would go in on foreign policy. The first one is Rebecca Lissner, who wrote it with Mira Rapp-Hooper, who is currently a senior director on the National Security Council. It's called The Open World. That's from 2019. And Phil Gordon wrote a piece called What America Can Achieve After Trump. Now, this is from 2020. He was talking about the upcoming administration, but it persists as a concern, I think. I strongly suggest that your listeners read those pieces, check them out. They are more specific, more detailed, and more kind of vision oriented than you might expect, from the titles. And I don't know, anyone who tells you they know what kind of approach Harris is going to take, they don't. But I think it's fair to assume that it'll be informed by some of that kind of thinking.
Thank you very much, Justin. And Foreign Affairs September-October issue is out now. And now, Monocle's Anita Riotta caught up with Alex Heeyeon Kil, editor-in-chief of Monochromator, a new Sorbonne and Berlin-based magazine. Monochromator joins sister publication Prism Off and investigates the political layers of our entertainment culture. In their first ever issue, Monochromator dove into the Barbenheimer phenomenon and what it says about U.S. imperialism. But first, Anita asked Alex to explain the driving concept behind the term monochromator.
If prism brings a single beam of light into a spectrum of different colors, monochromator does exact opposite. So it brings the spectrum into a monochrome. So monochromator brings 2 to 3 things together to come up with one single manifesto. And the manifesto is the backbone of all of the analyses that go into the magazine. And I say 2 to 3 things instead of films because we are hoping to expand our horizon beyond just films. So, for example, we're talking about doing an issue on the TV series such as White Lotus or Beef. We're also talking about doing an issue that compares a film with its original novel. And even in the first issue, we talked about Barbenheimer not just as films, but also as the whole cultural phenomenon. And I say manifesto instead of topics because the political agenda of our table of contents is really important. So what we want to accomplish is make films political again. And yeah, the idea of monochromator is really simple. So we put one thing together with another thing to come up with a different thing. That's the manifesto. So what we're hoping to accomplish is politicizing something that is unexpected by monochromating different texts.
That's amazing. And you can so feel that in this first issue with Barbenheimer. And you talk about how the two movies, and I won't give away too much for people who are going to go get the issue, but it's such an interesting way to take these two concepts that might seem disparate and completely opposite, but you put them together in such an interesting way. And it almost seems like an obvious tie-in after you read the magazine, but you take it in such a direction that's unexpected. It's so interesting. In your editor's letter in this first issue, you have an amazing anecdote about how, about the genesis of this first issue. I'd really love for our listeners to be able to hear that. Can you tell us a bit about that story?
Yeah, so that story is about Walmart. And when I was in LA last summer for LA Art Book Fair organized by Printed Matter. And I haven't been back to that country for 3 long years since COVID. And at this point, we were still struggling with which films we're going to work with for our first issue. So my first morning there, I wanted to wash my hair. So I was looking for shampoo at a Walmart and I was shocked at how patriotic the entire place was. Of course, capitalistic, I expected and I remembered, but I didn't expect rows and rows of American flags would be displaced alongside cereal. And at this point, I was already living in Berlin where grocery stores are really depressing and patriotism doesn't really get a good rep in Germany. So then I had a very important realization after seeing this. I realized that I am living in a country that lost the World War II, but I am in a country that won the World War II and is still living in its patriotic glory. It was Barbenheimer summer last year, and it wasn't that difficult to see that Walmart was also Barbenheimer. The soft capitalistic power of corporations that fills the superstores and the hard military power of the American patriotic glory. These two things were displayed together blatantly at Walmart. After that trip to Walmart, I knew I had to make an issue on Barbenheimer. The two films are the origin stories of American imperialism, and I think that was a very important political topic in this age, especially because American elections are coming up. And the manifesto of the first issue is Birth of a Nation, which is informed by that combination of consumer culture with patriotism that I witnessed in Walmart. And I thought that was a really good debut topic because Oppenheimer, Barbie, and Birth of a Nation are things that only make sense when they are thought together. And that trip to Walmart enabled me to do exactly that.
I love that. Who knew you could have such revelations standing in a Walmart? So going back to exactly that concept you're talking about, bringing disparate things together, which is the guiding force of Monochromator, I want to talk a little bit about your cover and the art throughout the magazine, because I feel like it really embodies that idea of juxtaposition. Can you tell us about how you thought about the art in the magazine and how you sort of tackled getting the artists that you wanted involved?
Our beautiful cover and our identity design was done by Amsterdam-based Singaporean graphic designer Cleo Tay, and she understood immediately that bringing different elements together was the core of our spirit. And while we're a magazine about films, the discourse that is created by quote unquote monochromating is at the center stage. So from the very get-go of the process, we decided that we won't use the film stills. And this is a conscious decision to emphasize the words over films. And if you look at Monochromator, you'll see that it's a very beautiful magazine. And it's a text-heavy magazine that almost reads like a book. And one of the things that we pursue is archiving the political urgencies of today. The political urgency of the first manifesto, Birth of a Nation, calls for the relevance of past events, such as the birth of Barbies and birth of the atomic bomb. And it also calls for us to understand their power over the present. So then the answer for the artistic direction was archival images. Except for the original 3D artwork on Absurdism and Barbenheimer done by Gina Lee, all of the images are from various archives. And this was actually one of my favorite parts of the magazine because these archival images really show the raw past, I think. For example, my favorite archival image in the magazine is a picture of Enrico Fermi, and he was a very important physicist who was part of the Manhattan Project. In the picture, he is with the Native American residents of Los Alamos. The image is featured in our article called Birth of a Nation Was the Death of Indigenous Peoples. This super raw past printed in a present in a magazine that you can hold physically now enforces that relevance of that past. And so the artistic direction of the magazine was also informed by bigger thoughts and ideas that hold the whole magazine together.
Zooming out a little bit to the project as a whole, I'd love to ask you, you are two young women of color at the top of the masthead, you and your publisher, Veronica. Can you tell me about how that's informed your work and any advice that you'd have to others hoping to follow in your path?
Yes, so we are two young Asian women in their early 30s. I think triggers of marginalization can always be diverse. So in the Korean market, we are two young women, and abroad, we suddenly become two young women of color. And I think this informs me in a way that it offers me a very unique perspective. I say Monochromator is based between Seoul and Berlin, and this betweenness is exactly what enables us to penetrate those places that might have been unseen before. I think translating Barbenheimer into Birth of a Nation in order to talk about American imperialism was also possible because we're outsiders. So I'd like to say that if you feel in between places and therefore don't belong anywhere, that in between place is precisely where you belong, and that has a beauty of its own.
That's amazing. I love that. For our listeners and your readers, what is it that you and your team want them to take away from this magazine?
On our Instagram page right now, our bio is Make Films Political Again. To be more exact, it would be make engaging with films political again. I hope our readers find joy in politicizing what was once thought unpolitical or thinking about politics through films. And I hope our readers to take away critical thinking in their daily lives, rigorous critical thinking in their daily lives, even when they're watching big blockbuster franchise films like we did in the first issue.
And as we mentioned, this is your very first issue, so congratulations. But I'm curious, what was that process with first-time publishing? What was your experience like? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Honestly, the hardest part was the fact that it was the first issue, as you pointed out. That was really difficult because we had to come up with a concept that didn't exist yet in the world. The practical side of the things were better because we are supported by the press, a prism of press that has almost 10 years of experience. But we had to come up with a whole new concept, and it also had to be sustainable as a series. And that was challenging because we wanted to create a very new concept of a film magazine. Monochromator doesn't really introduce new films, and we also don't really focus on criticisms that talk about the artistic or the technical achievements of a film either. So we had to discover what we will contribute to existing film criticism and for what we're making this magazine. That was one thing, but then another thing was to put all of these things together in a frame of a brand. This was a whole other task that required months of discussion. We needed to get the magazine as well, just like our readers. And I think that was the biggest difficulty of the first issue, and also the most exciting part. Because of this, explaining the concept of the magazine to our contributors and finding who we want to work with was also one of the hardest parts. It was really important for us to work with contributors who empathized with our agenda, which is the sociopolitical angle to criticism. And there are way too many good film critics out there. But to find someone who really fits our identity was a big task. So I read a lot. For months, I was just reading about different articles on different fields from different platforms. And this sounds a little bit creepy, but in the end, I came up with a list of 100 and plus potential contributors.
Oh my God.
And yeah, it's organized by field, and we narrowed down from there, and the list is still growing.
Well, that's kind of a perfect segue to my next question, because clearly you have a solid bank of contributors for, I would say, a few more issues. But can you tell us a little bit of what's next for Monochromator?
Well, the second issue, we want to talk about genocide. It almost feels incorrect to say that it's not an easy topic, but it is not an easy topic, and we're doing it through films Zone of Interest by Jonathan Glazer and Act of Killing by Joshua Oppenheimer, another Oppenheimer. And the manifesto will be We Refuse to Be Afraid.
Wow. That's amazing. I'm already excited to see that issue. Before I leave you, Alex, let's share the love a little bit. What other magazines are you reading and loving at the moment?
So I'm loving two magazines right now, both based in Berlin. So one is called Stuck, which interviews artists about their artistic process and different sources of inspiration. The newest issue deals with nostalgia, and the artistic direction of it screams the 90s with like foldable pages and sticker packs and things like this. And just like other writers and artists, I often feel stuck for whatever reason. And reading Stuck magazine makes me feel like I'm a part of a bigger creative community.
And that's it for this week's show. My thanks as ever to our editor, Jack Juras. Any comments or queries, feel free to write to me, Fernando, at fp@monocle.com. We're back next Saturday at 10 a.m. London time. Meanwhile, you can always listen again at monocle.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And you can also listen to The Stack on YouTube. You've been listening to The Stack. I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Thank you very much.